Welcome to another episode of Talking About Records. My name is G.I. Sanders from NTX Vinyl, a small independent record shop north of the Dallas-Fort Worth area. I am excited to be here yet again with another great topic. This one is near and dear to me. As I mentioned, Dallas-Fort Worth is where I reside. That's where NTX Vinyl is. I am born and raised in Dallas. Was heavily involved in the local music scene, and that's what this video is going to talk all about. There are a ton of great artists who have come out of the Dallas, really the North Texas area over the last 20, 30 years, and going back even further, obviously. But for my time, when I was in junior high, high school, starting to really cut my teeth and get into music, it was the early 90s, and it was a great time to be in Dallas in the early 90s if you were a music fan, especially a fan of rock and roll, alternative music, many different genres, but those were my specialties. That's what I was engaged with. So I'm going to call out a number of records that I love, that I happen to own. There's not that many of them, honestly, because vinyl was not being pressed in the early 90s or all throughout the 90s, even into the 2000s. And so for local artists, they were really dependent on CDs, cassettes and CDs. Vinyl was much more expensive to press. There was not as many opportunities to get that done. And of course, not as many people had turntables, so why would you press them, right? In 1995, there weren't that many people still listening to vinyl records because the CD had taken over. This is obvious. And so it's been part of my kind of challenge over the years to try and acquire as many of these records, going back to these local artists that I really enjoyed. But again, a lot of them don't exist, and if they do exist, they're very rare. So these are some of the ones that I've picked up over the years. I've also got a local label that I've created along with a couple of really good friends called the DFW Legacy Series, where we're actually reviving some of these albums that were never pressed to vinyl, and a couple of these are on my list. So I'm excited to talk about those as well. But let's dive in. If you're familiar with the Dallas-Fort Worth music scene from the 90s and 2000s, some of these may be familiar. Some of these artists did have some national success as well, but if you're not familiar, maybe these are some artists you can check out or discover. Again, this is very catered to local music and to the Dallas music scene. Something I've got a ton of passion for. So let's kick it off with an artist. I thought if there was going to be one artist to kick this off when I think about, again, the early 90s of Dallas music, for me, this is one that really stands out, and this is Smoke 'Em If You Got 'Em by the Reverend Horton Heat. The Reverend Horton Heat has been a fixture in Dallas since this record, and even prior. The Deep Ellum scene, which is the arts district here in Dallas, where the majority of the rock and roll clubs, live music venues reside still to this day. A very vibrant scene, if you will, especially in the early 90s. And the Rev was a fixture in launching that scene. If you go back to some of the earliest days of the late 80s, early 90s, he was pioneering live music, live original music in Deep Ellum and around Dallas. A really interesting sound. The Reverend Horton Heat, if you're not familiar, is kind of like a mix of rockabilly and rock and roll. It's a throwback, but a really, really unique vibe, which I think is cool. This is his first full length. It comes on a really cool black and white kind of swirl split vinyl. It was put out, as you can see, on Sub Pop Records, which is obviously not a Dallas label, but he found recognition really early on Sub Pop, and he went on a number of incredible tours. The biggest tour I ever saw the Rev on was actually in '94 when he was open for Soundgarden. That was just an incredible moment for a local band to be able to get that national tour was incredible, and especially because he wasn't playing straight down the middle alternative rock. Again, this is kind of a rockabilly vibe, stand-up bass, just a different vibe. But he had so much respect in the scene, not only locally but nationally. This record is the standout to me. It's what put him on the map. Key Tracks, Bullet, Put It To Me Straight, Marijuana, just a really fun record. Again, came out in 1990, features obviously the Rev. You've got Jim Wallace on upright bass and Taz Bentley on drums. All three people who have been involved in this band and in other local bands for the last 20, 30 years. And so I thought if I'm going to kick off a top 10 of my local DFW vinyl records, the Rev had to be early on that list, if not at the very beginning. So that's one that I really appreciate. I actually picked this up recently at a local record shop up in Ohio. I could not believe it when I saw it. If it was around here in Dallas, it would get snapped up really quickly. So I was happy to find it out of town, which was cool. So check out the Rev if you're not familiar. If you're into that type of scene, kind of a rockabilly, alternative rock type of vibe, he's definitely one to check out. All right. Also in 1990, this is the only compilation I have on the list. Everything else is full-length albums by individual artists. But this one, it's got a really cool story. This is called Dude, You Rock. As you can see, Dallas 1990. The deal, we get everything, you get nothing forever. I love this record for a number of reasons. First and foremost, the artwork on this record is spectacular. It is designed by Mike Graff from a band called Course of Empire, who may or may not have a record in here as well. But Mike was an incredible artist and designed not only this record cover, but many others, including those for his band Course of Empire. This is a compilation that came out in '90. It was curated and produced by the great Jeff Lyles. Jeff Lyles being very active in the local music scene, again, still to this day. The Decadent Dub Team was tracked by his group at the time. Course of Empire is on this. The Reverend Horton Heat is on this. Rigor Mortis. Also Last Rites, Shallow Rain, Three on a Hill, Loco Gringo. So as far as the late 80s and early 90s alternative scene, this album was an incredible compilation, an incredible mix that really captured the vibe of what was going on in Dallas at that time. It was pressed on a couple different colors, I think. This is the red translucent version that I've had for a number of years. I cherish this record because of what it means and what the kind of time and place of it, but also because a really good friend gave it to me. And it's one of the things that's kind of a memento of his life because he's no longer with us. But this album is really special to me. I play it often, and again, it's just a great snapshot of that local 90s period. I'm sorry, that local music period of the early 90s. So Dude, You Rock, definitely check this out. It's also on cassette. I think it's on CD as well, but the vinyl is obviously the one you want. Really, really cool album. So check that one out. Next up, we're going to move forward a little bit to 1995. There were a number of bands that were either from Dallas or Denton or Fort Worth or even Oklahoma City. The Nixons weren't actually from Dallas, but if you ask them, and I have, they'll attribute a ton of their success to breaking in the Dallas scene. This was their second full-length album, their first on a major label. So this came out on MCA Records in 1995. It contains a number of songs that were included on their first record, which was called Halo, that came out independently or on an independent label. This again is released in '95. This is on a really nice kind of Coke bottle clear vinyl. This contains the big hit Sister, which they are most known for. Also the title track, Head, Wire, Blind, Fellowship, Happy Song, just kind of a greatest hits if you're a Nixons fan. This is an album that really had a big impact on me. It was at a time when I was living in local clubs. I was seeing every live band that I could, and the Nixons were on fire, pun intended, during this period between kind of 93 and 95 locally before they really hit nationally and then started touring. You could catch them at every club in town across the whole Metroplex, and the shows were incredible. The energy was incredible. I had the pleasure of actually playing in a band years later with their drummer, John Humphrey, who's now in the band Seether. He started out in the Nixons, if you weren't familiar with that. So check the Nixons out. They're actually active again today, which is really cool. Kind of reformed after a long period off. And their lead singer, Zach Malloy, is a very established singer-songwriter nationally now, based in Nashville. So the Nixons, again, were one of those bands that brought the energy live, and they had the recordings to back it up. I loved Halo, I love Foma, and even the later records are great too. So definitely check out the Nixons if you're not familiar with them. If you're from the Dallas area, I'm sure you are. But again, actually came out of Oklahoma City, but very much adopted as a Dallas local band by everyone involved. So love that record. All right, the next record on the list is actually one that I put out. This is Aqua Vita by Dusu. First time on vinyl, put out by the DFW Legacy series, again, which is a local kind of micro label that myself and a couple of really good friends founded in the last year. This is one that the band Dusu had talked about putting out on vinyl for a number of years recently and just couldn't really get it over the hump. So I was ecstatic that we were able to step in and help them get it across the finish line. It is an absolutely critically important to my teen years. There was a couple versions of it. This version is the kind of blue and white splatter swirl version. This is a double LP. The artwork was completely recreated as a gatefold package. Really proud of how this came out. Limited to 300 copies, again, on the DFW Legacy series. Dusu was a band. Their first record was called So-Called the Cupboard's Bare. That's what turned me on to them. They had a couple early cassettes prior to that, but their first full length was So-Called the Cupboard's Bare, which was an incredible album and really put them on the map in the local scene, starting to headline clubs. And then came Aquavita next, which had, I would say, a much more polished sound. I think the songs as well were a lot more polished and progressive from that first record. They solidified their lineup with this album, which I think is really important. They had a few lineup switches in the early days, but this record in particular really established them as a headliner locally, and they got to go on a number of national tours supporting this record and their following record as well. It's hard to describe their sound. It's kind of like a Fugazi, Jane's Addiction, Chevelle filter, a perfect circle thing. It's very progressive. There are hooks, tons of great guitar riff, two vocalists, Casey Hess and Eric Shudd, who traded the lead vocals back and forth, which I always thought was just an incredibly original thing. You didn't see that often, where from song to song you'd have a different lead singer up there on stage, and both their voices were completely unique as well. And so the blend of them together created a really unique sound, and I think the entire vibe that Dusu represented, not only on this record, but their entire career, was really unique. And I think honestly it kind of hurt them because they couldn't break through nationally because radio stations, promoters, they just couldn't find a place to pigeonhole them, right? But as a live band and even on the recordings, I think their work stands for themselves. And again, I just couldn't be prouder that I had a small hand in bringing this one to vinyl. So definitely check out Aquavita by Dusu. It's still available now if you're interested. You can go to dfwlegacyseries.com and grab yourself a copy before they're all gone, because again, they're limited to 300. So that's an album that came out in 1999 that I still listen to frequently. All right, next on the list, this is a band also came out in 1999 originally, not the vinyl, but at least the CD did. And if you're going to talk about fixtures of the Dallas scene in the early to mid 90s all the way through the early 2000s, you're not going to get very far without talking about Tripping Daisy. They're a band that I talk about a lot. I feature a lot of their albums because I just love them. This is probably the most unique release in their discography. It is called Tops of Our Heads. It was almost entirely improvised. It was released in '99, like I mentioned, after they had been dropped from their major label deal. So they were falling back on their independent label, Good Records, which is also a record store here in town that is still here to this day. And this one was completely unique because they went into the studio with very little planned. There's a cover song on this called Never My Love by The Association, and there's one original track that they had pre-written. But the rest of it, it's like 25 minutes long. The rest of it, they went into the studio and literally made it up on the spot. You can hear Tim DeLauder, the lead singer, actually calling out chord changes on the recording. It's recorded live to tape. It's just such a special piece. This is limited to 500 copies. I don't think you'll be able to see it, but it's hand numbered to 500 copies on this front cover, which is a double-sided or a screen printed insert. And then the record itself is a really unique jacket. I'm pretty sure this is a screen printed, or just like it's printed on a really nice textured cardboard. It's got a sticker on front with the info, Good Records recordings on the back. and it is printed on a red kind of translucent vinyl. I think all of these are a little different. This one's pretty clear, red translucent. So again, to me, when you think about unique albums in my collections from DFW, this is one that definitely stands out. Again, only 500 copies being made of it is a big deal. And then again, just I think in the band's career, they had an incredible discography from Bill to Firecracker, Jesus Hits Like the Atom Bomb, and then their last self-titled release. The other reason this one was really important, and correct me if I'm wrong, as I'm sure someone will, but I believe this was the last time that Wes Bergeron, who passed away, and then the band split, I believe this is the last time he recorded with the band was on this record as far as an actual release, not live or anything. But so it's a really special one to me. If you're a Tripping Daisy fan, try and track one down. They're not very easy to find, obviously being limited to 500, but just a great album. And again, their self-titled record was released after, that's right, it was released after this one, so that was technically the last one Wes was on, but I think this was the last one he recorded on that they released while he was still with us. So love Tripping Daisy and love that record. Going back a little bit, I mentioned it with Daisy. If you're going to talk about fixtures of the Dallas-Fort Worth scene, especially bands that broke out nationally and had success, the Toadies and Rubberneck was huge. Probably the biggest record to come out of Dallas, honestly, in that mid-90s period. I can't think of another one that probably sold more or got more exposure nationally or internationally. This is a reissue that came out in 2020. As you can see, it's signed by the band and still sealed. I've got a couple play copies of this one as well. This is put out on Kirtland Records. It was originally released on Interscope Records. And you know, what can you say? If you're familiar with the Toadies, you know how much or how killer of a record this is. Every track, top to bottom, solid. This is one where you don't want to skip around. The big single was Possum Kingdom. They also had singles in Tyler, which was huge, and also the song Away. But then you've got I Come From the Water and I Burn and Backslider. You've got Mexican Hairless, the instrumental opening track that just sets this thing off in the right direction. Saw the band countless times in the early days, and have seen them recently too, because they're still very active to this day, which is an amazing thing. So Rubberneck is just one of those quintessential records from the DFW rock scene of the 90s. It was incredibly exciting to see their trajectory from an exposure standpoint. This was their first full-length record. They had an EP out before this called Pleather, which I hope will see the light of day on vinyl at some point. And then after this, there was a long delay and a long delayed, frustrating period for the band, I believe, where Interscope didn't want to put out the follow-up to this, and it took them a long time, and they lost a lot of momentum. They eventually regained it, I think, but that next record, Hell Below, Stars Above, is also incredible. Still also not available on vinyl, unfortunately. But Rubberneck is the peak album. It's what Toadies are known for, and a lot of what the Deep Ellum scene from the early 90s are known for. If you were frequently at a place like Trees, a local venue, a very iconic venue, or Bomb Factory, or places like the Rec Room, originally a theater in Fort Worth, or Rick's Place in Denton. These are all local clubs that some of them are still around, some of them are not, but that's where you got to see Toadies in their full power, just to a packed club, but of just a couple hundred people. And you knew it at the time when you saw Toadies or Tripping Daisy or some of these other bands that I'm kind of talking about. Like, you could see it, and it was super exciting for us locally as fans and as fellow musicians to see that, man, we had a scene that was just as strong as what was going on anywhere else in the country or the world. And I think this album really proved that. So Toadies, Rubberneck, can't speak highly enough about that one. Came out in '94. All right, next on the list, another debut. This is the debut album by Centromatic, Redo the Stacks. I absolutely love this record. Came out in '96, '97 by the great, this is a band fronted by the great Will Johnson, who was previously the drummer in a band called Funland. So there's very few of these artists and these albums that are not connected in some way. This one being a good example because there's a lot of history here, and Will Johnson himself has had an incredible career, not only with Funland and then Centromatic. He founded a band called South Sam Gabriel. He has tons of solo records out. He's played with the likes of Monsters and Folk, so just a phenomenal record. This is one that introduced me, you know, it being their first full length. They have a lot of records, but I think if I'm going to talk about standout tracks, Fidgeting Wildly on this record is one of my favorites. That's probably the one that got me into the band and was to really open my eyes. It was recorded by Matt Pence, who I believe played drums on the album as well. And just like as far as rock, alternative, indie rock, whatever you want to call it, great songs, great instrumentation, really raw but powerful, not overly produced. That's how I would describe Centromatic. So if you're into kind of a, I don't know who I would compare them to. It's almost got a, like, if you could compare them to like a Weezer or something like that, I would say, but maybe not quite as pop, but more on the indie side. That's probably where I would categorize this if I was forced to, but I'm not. Great live shows, really fun band. I've seen them a number of times, obviously in Dallas, and I've seen them in other cities as well, where I've crossed paths with them. So look up Will Johnson, look up Centromatic. He's got an incredible discography, and this is kind of where it all started as far as, again, when he started fronting this band after coming from Funland. So I love Centromatic, and I love that record. All right, we got a couple more. The next one on the list, one of the more recent records, recent meaning 2002. This is Weightless by Slow Roosevelt. This is another album, the second album, just like Dusu's Aquavita, that I had the pleasure to bring to vinyl to the very first time. It was originally released on Brando Records, an incredible local record label that I had a lot of involvement with back in the day and put out some albums on myself. This is on a translucent blue swirl smoke vinyl. Weightless was the band's third record and featured the single Boys Lie, Girls Steal. It was picked up by Sony internationally, but in the United States was never re-released other than on Brando Records, I believe, locally. Produced by the great Alex Gerst, a good friend, and a great local studio. This was a really hard-hitting record. It is a really hard-hitting record. Influences, I would say, you know, Filter, Pantera, that type of heavy, right? Great songs, great hooks, a really great recording, and the vinyl came out amazing. We were so ecstatic to be able to press this. This is one of the first albums we talked about when we got together with the DFW Legacy series. When we formed that label, there were a number of bands that we said, oh, this is a no-brainer if we can get permission from the artist and the label to do it, which they did. Really good people in the band, and really proud to have worked with them. I was in a band at this time and got to play a lot of shows with Slow Roosevelt and really interact with them. And then going back years prior when the band was on One Ton Records, which is another local label here in Dallas that also was the home of Dusu. These bands at the time were really tearing up the local scene. There was a number of bands on that label that had a huge impact locally, not only on, again, fans, but also kind of musicians like myself. It really inspired us to pick up an instrument and kind of get up on stage and do it. And so I have a great appreciation for this record. It's a shame it didn't get more exposure nationally, but locally I think it's got a big fan base. And this is another one that's limited to 300 copies and still available now at dfwlegacyseries.com if you want to check it out. They're all hand numbered and on colored vinyl. So I love Slow Ro, love Weightless. This was, in my opinion, their best record. I love the first two records too, but I think they really dialed it in, and everything aligned on this one from a songwriting perspective, production perspective, and they were just a force to be reckoned with live. So check out Slow Ro if you're into some heavy music. Two more. Next on the list, also from 2002, by coincidence, but a completely different genre, a completely different style of music, and that is Shasha by Ben Queller. A great pop rock indie record. Ben Queller first found success in a band called Radish that had some actually more international success than anything. He put out a couple records, was signed really early when he was just a young kid, and this was his first full-length solo record. This was a 2018 reissue. There are originals of this that were released overseas that are basically impossible to find. So I was incredibly excited when I think it was a Record Store Day 2018 release when this was finally brought to vinyl and made more readily available. I remember seeing Ben Queller in the early days touring on this record. Wasted and Ready was the big single. Family Tree, Commerce, Texas, in other words, a really amazing track called Lizzie, named after his wife, or I think his future wife at this stage. But a huge Ben Queller fan, super nice dude, super great discography across kind of rock, indie, alternative, country, Americana. He does a little bit of everything. Super talented songwriter. He's done a lot of co-writing and production stuff, I think, as well. So for me, this is just one of those records that stands out because, again, in 2002, I was heavily involved in the local scene. And when this came out, we had the opportunity to see Ben on this tour at all the small clubs in Dallas and around the Metroplex. So that was really, really cool to see after he had been in Radish and been very popular and had seen that band many times. And then to see him branch out and go solo with a little bit of a different vibe. And see him find a bunch of success because this was released on ATO Records, which again is a pretty prominent record label still around to this day. Puts out records by, you know, My Morning Jacket and Black Pumas and just an amazing roster of artists. So BK was a big part of that when ATO was founded early on. So I love Shasha, super fun record. Check out BK if you're into singer-songwriters. Another great release to come out of Dallas. Last but not least, this is a band I mentioned earlier at the very top, and it's a single actually because the full-length album doesn't exist on vinyl, unfortunately. Hopefully, maybe one day. But this is Course of Empire, and this is Infested. It came off of the album Initiation. It was this 12-inch single was released in 1994. Talk about a force to be reckoned with live. Course of Empire was one of the go-to bands in the local scene in the early 90s through the mid 90s. If you were looking to get blown away live, I just can't think of another band that did a better job. They had two drummers on stage, the great Chad Lavelle and the great Michael Jerome, and just a really unique industrial metal alternative sound. This was off their first record, or I'm sorry, off their second record, Initiation, and then they followed this up with Telepathic Last Words, I think is the name of the last record. None of them have ever been released on vinyl, unfortunately. To my knowledge, this single, as well as the dude, what is it, the Dallas Rocks, Dude You Rock, compilation, I believe, are the only places you can get anything from Course of Empire on vinyl. I think that's going to change at some point soon. I may have some insight into that. I don't know when, I don't know what, but I know there's some stuff in the works to bring some Course of Empire material to vinyl, which would be incredible. They are one of those bands that set the stage for bands like the Toadies and Tripping Daisy and so many bands to follow, Slow Roosevelt, again, a lot of these that I named, again, I mentioned so many of them are connected. So they were playing shows and touring with a lot of those bands, and then they got signed to Zoo Entertainment and got to go on and put out the Initiation record internationally, as well as that follow-up. And they did have some success, but it was short-lived. I think the label had a bunch of problems, and it was kind of, again, one of those things where I don't think anyone knew where to position Course of Empire, because it was a pretty unique vibe, a pretty unique sound, but greatly appreciated. If you're, again, into kind of heavy rock, alternative, industrial stuff, I cannot recommend Course of Empire enough. This track, Infested, was an incredible song, 6 minutes long. It was their biggest hit, I believe, on radio, especially off Initiation. Locally, got a ton of play on all the local rock radio stations when local music was still being played a ton. So check out Infested, check out Initiation. This has a couple of cool remixed versions of it on it, which is very, very cool. So this also has oh yeah, it's got a club mix, album version, and the Darwin Goodwin mix where they loop in a bunch of horns on it. Super fun. Was also available on a CD single as well. So love Course of Empire. Can't recommend it enough. that's my list for local DFW vinyl records that I love from my collection. I am super excited to continue to add to this, not only from albums that I can find or albums that are being re-released, because vinyl is obviously resurging, but also from my label, the DFW Legacy Series, where we're continuing to put out albums by bands just like this, who come from that era of, you know, not only the 90s, but the 2000s, when vinyl just was not being pressed enough. But now that it's coming back, people are clamoring for it. I'm clamoring for it. I know my partners in the DFW Legacy Series are as well. So we're working as hard as we can to revive as many of those CDs as possible and bring them to your turntable. We've announced 10 albums, I think, at this point that we're pressing to vinyl. A couple of which I featured here. But again, go to dfwlegacyseries.com if you want to check it out more, and you can check out the whole the collection of titles we have available now, and also for pre-order. So thank you for listening. This has been Talking About Records. If you're into the Dallas music scene, I hope you enjoyed that. If you're not and you hung out this long, I really appreciate it. Hopefully maybe you can discover something new if you check out these artists. So my name is G.I. Sanders from NTX Vinyl. Make sure you subscribe to the channel, follow me on social media, and we'll talk to you next time.